Let the record show the motion passes 11-1. This project will proceed without Mr. Vance's protégé. That man will not touch my aircraft. I did not move. I did not blink. My hands, resting on the polished mahogany of the boardroom table, did not tremble. They were still, the knuckles calm, the fingers lying flat. Around me, 12 men in tailored suits shifted in their leather chairs, the subtle sounds of victory and relief filling the vacuum left by the chairman's pronouncement. Chairman Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently locked in a state of smug disappointment, looked directly at me. His words were not for the record, they were for me. A final, public severing. He had just made 11 mistakes, 11 separate, catastrophic errors in judgment, all bound together by a single vote. He just didn't know it yet. To understand the profound, echoing silence in that room, the silence that followed my dismissal, you have to go back. You have to understand the metal. It began, as most things in my life did, in the quiet hum of my father's garage. It wasn't a garage for cars, not really. It was a laboratory of integrity, a place where things were made right or they were not made at all. My father, a master mechanic who could diagnose an engine's ailment by the rhythm of its complaint, was a man of few words and infinite patience. He communicated through action, through the precise seating of a bearing, the clean weld of a joint, the patient turn of a wrench. He believed that the truth of a thing was not in its description, but in its function. "Talk is cheap, Elias," he'd say, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that was already more oil than cloth. "The work speaks for itself, and it never, ever lies." His most prized possession was not a tool of power, like a pneumatic hammer or a plasma cutter. It was a tool of precision, a torque wrench. It was an old thing, its steel worn smooth by his hands, the gauge markings faded but still true. He taught me how to use it when I was 10. "This," he said, placing its cool, heavy weight in my small hands, "is the most honest tool in this shop. It doesn't guess, it doesn't hope. It tells you when the work is done. Not too tight, not too loose, just right. You listen to that click, son. That click is the truth." I spent years learning the language of that click. It was a language of absolutes, of engineering certainty in a world of variables. It was the sound of a job done correctly. That sound became the foundational principle of my life. I didn't follow him into the world of combustion engines. I went further. I went into materials science, into the molecular architecture of alloys and composites. I was fascinated by the idea of creating materials that didn't exist yet, of designing metals atom by atom to achieve impossible strengths, impossible lightness. While my peers were chasing tenure and publishing papers, I was in my own lab, a space far more advanced than my father's garage, but spiritually identical. It was a place of quiet, relentless work, and after 12 years of failures, near misses, and one catastrophic furnace explosion that cost me my eyebrows for a month, I finally created it. I called it Ethelgard. Ethelgard 7, to be precise. It was a metal matrix composite, a whisper-light lattice of woven carbon nanotubes suspended in a proprietary aluminum scandium alloy, forged under immense electromagnetic pressure. It was, to put it simply, the strongest and lightest material for its density ever created by human hands. It was 40% lighter than titanium, with 3 times the tensile strength and a thermal resistance that bordered on the absurd. It was a material for the next century of flight. I patented the process, the composition, everything. I founded a small specialized company called Echelon Materials to produce it. We didn't mass produce. We created small, perfect batches for hyper-specific applications. We were the best in the world at one single thing. We made the impossible possible. That was how I met Arthur Vance. Vance Aeronautics was a titan, a legacy aerospace contractor that had been building planes since the propeller era. They were powerful, politically connected, and dangerously complacent. They won contracts based on their name, not their innovation. But they had landed the biggest prize of the decade, the Odyssey project. It was a next-generation strategic reconnaissance aircraft designed for hypersonic speeds and an operational ceiling that touched the edge of space. The problem was, the materials to build such a craft did not exist. Their designs were brilliant, their engines were revolutionary, but the airframe would tear itself apart under the stresses involved. Their best alloys would turn to molten slag on atmospheric re-entry. The project was stalled, bleeding money, a white elephant in a billion-dollar hangar. One of their young, ambitious engineers, a man named Dr. Eris Thorne, found my research. He saw that Ethelgard 7 wasn't just an improvement, it was the answer. The only answer. Vance Aeronautics came to me, not as a partner, but as a customer. They wanted to buy my material. I explained that it wasn't a commodity you could just purchase by the ton. Its production was inextricably linked to its application. The forging process had to be tailored to the geometry of the component it would become. To use Ethelgard, they needed its creator. Arthur Vance, the grandson of the company's founder, saw me as a necessary inconvenience. He was a man who moved through the world with the unshakable certainty of someone who had never been told no. He saw my small company, my quiet demeanor, my black skin, and he made a series of calculations. He saw a box to be checked, a story to be spun. He brought me on, not as a contractor, but as a special consultant, a title that sounded important but had no real authority. He called me his protégé in press releases, a shining example of Vance Aeronautics' commitment to new talent and diversity. In private, he treated me like a glorified supplier. He wanted my genius, but he did not want my voice. The first year was a startling success. Using Ethelgard 7, we solved the critical issues of thermal stress on the leading edges of the wings. We redesigned the engine housing, shedding 600 pounds while increasing structural integrity. The Odyssey was viable. It was flying in simulations, breaking every record. My material worked. It did exactly what I said it would do. The work was speaking. But Arthur Vance wasn't listening. The conflict arose over a subcontractor, a company called Sterling Machining. They were an old guard firm run by a friend of Vance's, and they had been awarded the contract to manufacture the main fuselage spars. These were the bones of the aircraft. They had to be perfect. My contract with Vance Aeronautics was explicit. Any component made from Ethelgard 7 required an echelon material supervisor on site during the forging process. The tolerances were sub-micron. The thermal quenching sequence had to be timed to the millisecond. There was no room for error. I flew to the Sterling facility in Ohio. What I found was horrifying. They were treating my material like common steel. They had modified the heating curve to speed up production, a deviation of less than 5%, but enough to introduce microscopic fractures in the crystalline structure. They were skipping a final stage cryogenic tempering process because it was time-consuming. I presented the data to the plant manager. He dismissed it. "We've been machining parts for 50 years, son. I think we know what we're doing." I told him to halt production immediately. He laughed and called Arthur Vance. That was the beginning of the end. I was summoned back to headquarters. I found myself in a preliminary meeting with Vance and Chairman Thompson, who oversaw the Odyssey project for the board. I laid out the data calmly. I showed them the stress simulations. The fuselage spars, as Sterling was producing them, would fail. Not immediately. They would pass all ground tests. They would hold up for the first dozen flight tests. But somewhere around the 50th flight hour, under maximum hypersonic stress, they would experience catastrophic structural collapse. The aircraft wouldn't just break apart, it would vaporize. Vance didn't look at my data. He looked at me. "Sterling is one of our most trusted partners, Elias. Are you accusing them of incompetence?" "I am not accusing anyone," I said, my voice even. "I am stating a fact based on material science. The process is flawed. The components are compromised." Thompson leaned forward, his voice a low, condescending purr. "What you're stating, son, is that your process is so delicate, so fragile, that seasoned professionals can't be trusted with it. It sounds to me like the problem isn't with Sterling, but with your exotic material." They saw it as an attack on their world, their network of friends, their way of doing business. I was the outsider, the variable they couldn't control. My insistence on empirical truth was an affront to their authority. They wanted my magic trick, but they refused to believe in the magician. The work was speaking, shouting a warning, and they put their hands over their ears and told it to be quiet. Vance made it clear, I was to sign off on Sterling's components, or I would be removed from the project. I refused. That refusal led me to this boardroom, to this vote. The board consisted of 12 men. 11 of them were from the same mold as Vance and Thompson. Old money, old school, men who believed their intuition outweighed data. The 12th was Dr. Eris Thorne, the young physicist who had found me. He was the only one in the room who understood the science. He had seen my data. He had run his own simulations. He knew I was right. Thompson conducted the meeting like a show trial. He framed it as a choice between a trusted, long-term partner and a new, unproven, and frankly, uncooperative consultant. He spoke of timelines and budgets, never of safety or science. He painted me as an obstructionist, a perfectionist whose demands were putting the entire project at risk. He never once mentioned my warnings of catastrophic failure. When it came time to vote, the hands went up, one after another. A sea of aging white hands, sealing the fate of their own flagship project. Only one hand remained down, Dr. Thorne's. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of apology and disgust. "Let the record show the motion passes, 11-1, Thompson announced, his voice dripping with satisfaction. He then delivered the final personal blow. "This project will proceed without Mr. Vance's protégé. That man will not touch my aircraft." The words hung in the air, thick and vile. He didn't use my name. He didn't have to. I was just that man. I slowly, deliberately closed my laptop. I gathered the 3 printed reports I had brought with me, tapping their edges on the table to align them into a perfect stack. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I had learned from my father that the moment of greatest pressure is the moment for greatest calm. You do not fight the machine. You do not argue with the wrench. You simply do the work. I pushed my chair back. The soft scrape against the thick carpet was the only sound in the room. I stood, and for a moment, I held the gaze of every man there. I looked at Vance, who refused to meet my eyes. I looked at Thompson, who stared back with open hostility. I looked at the 9 others, their faces a mixture of indifference and discomfort. Finally, I looked at Dr. Thorne. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. I turned and walked toward the door. I did not rush. Each footstep was measured, silent on the plush flooring. I felt 11 pairs of eyes on my back, watching the problem walk away. They believed they had solved it. They believed they had excised the tumor of my dissent. As my hand closed around the cold brass handle of the boardroom door, I thought of my father's torque wrench. I thought of the quiet, definitive click it made when the precise amount of force had been applied. Thompson and his board had just finished tightening a bolt. They thought the job was done. They had no idea they had just tightened it past its breaking point. I stepped out into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind me with a quiet, hydraulic hiss. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt like the beginning of something, not an ending. In my pocket, my phone was a dense, silent weight. I had one call to make, not to a lawyer, not to a reporter. It was a call I had hoped I would never have to place, a contingency I had built into the very structure of my business. A dead man's switch, designed for a moment just like this. My contract with Vance Aeronautics was over 200 pages long, a dense forest of legalese. I knew with absolute certainty that Arthur Vance had never read it. He had his lawyers glance over it, and they, seeing the small letterhead of Echelon Materials, had assumed it was a standard supplier agreement. They missed Clause 37B, the key person provision. Clause 37B was simple. It stipulated that due to the unique and proprietary nature of Ethelgard 7, its use was licensed to Vance Aeronautics contingent upon the direct, unimpeded project oversight of its creator, and the CEO of Echelon Materials. Me. My involuntary removal from that oversight role, as determined by my sole discretion, constituted an immediate and total breach of the licensing agreement. It triggered a second clause, 41C. The immediate revocation of all intellectual property rights, technical support, and material supply. The work was about to speak so loudly it would deafen them. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway, past the framed pictures of historic Vance aircraft. I didn't go to the elevator. I went to a small, unoccupied office and closed the door. I took out my phone. I dialed the number of my company's legal counsel, a woman named Miriam who was as precise and unyielding as the alloys I created. She answered on the first ring. "Elias," she said. Her tone was calm, but I could hear the question underneath. "Miriam," I replied, my voice steady. "Execute Protocol Phoenix, effective immediately." There was a pause, not of hesitation, but of confirmation. "Understood, Elias. Are you secure?" "I am," I said. "Then it's done," she replied. "The notifications are automated. The first will be sent in 5 minutes." "Thank you, Miriam." I ended the call. Protocol Phoenix was the name we had given to the cascade of legal actions tied to Clause 37B. It was not a lawsuit. It was a shutdown. It was a series of pre-drafted, digitally signed notices that would be dispatched simultaneously to a dozen different entities. The first, as Miriam said, was already on its way. It was an email delivered to the entire Vance Aeronautics Board, their legal department, and their head of procurement. It was a formal notice of contract breach and immediate termination of the Ethelgard 7 license. It informed them that as of that exact moment, every square inch of the wonder material in their possession was now considered patent-infringing intellectual property. All future shipments were canceled. All technical support was terminated. I imagined the scene back in the boardroom. The self-congratulatory handshakes, the relieved sighs. Thompson would be pouring a celebratory scotch. Their phones would begin to chime, one by one. They would see the subject line, "Urgent, Notice of Breach and License Termination, Agreement VA-EM-001." They would read it. They would not understand it at first. They would assume it was a bluff, a desperate, petulant act from the man they had just fired. Vance would probably laugh. He would tell everyone to ignore it. He would be wrong. The second notice went out 10 minutes later. This one was not addressed to Vance. It was addressed to the United States Department of Defense, specifically to the Office of General Marcus Thorne, no relation to Eris, the Program Director for Advanced Aerospace Projects at the Pentagon. The Odyssey was a military contract, a matter of national security. The notice was concise. It informed the DoD that their prime contractor, Vance Aeronautics, no longer had legal access to the core technology required to build the Odyssey aircraft. It cited the specific contract numbers and attached a copy of my terminated license agreement. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that the project was now technologically impossible to complete under the current arrangement. The third notice went to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It was a formal disclosure from Echelon Materials, stating that a material change had occurred in the viability of the Odyssey project, a project Vance Aeronautics had repeatedly touted to its shareholders as the future of the company. It suggested that Vance's public statements regarding the project's progress might now be considered misleading. The other 9 notices went to the other 9 board members who had voted against me. Not to them personally, but to the legal departments of the major corporations they ran. Each notice was slightly different, but the message was the same. It informed them that due to a recent breach of contract by a shared partner, Echelon Materials was initiating a comprehensive review of all its supply and technology agreements. My company, though small, was a specialist. We supplied unique components to dozens of high-tech firms. Those 9 men, in voting to protect their friend's incompetent subcontractor, had just put their own company's critical supply chains at risk. They had voted as a bloc, as members of a club. They were about to discover that their actions had consequences far beyond the Odyssey boardroom. I left the building. I didn't take the main exit. I used a side door and walked out into the cool afternoon air. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the massive hangars. I got into my car, a simple, unassuming sedan, and I drove home. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove in silence. My home is a quiet place, minimalist, organized. My personal workshop is in the back, a climate-controlled space that is as much a sanctuary as a laboratory. I walked in and switched on the soft, overhead lights. There, on a clean, felt-lined workbench, was my father's torque wrench. I picked it up. The weight was familiar, comforting. It was a tool of integrity. It did not have an opinion. It only measured truth. I stood there for a long time, just holding it, feeling the worn steel in my hand. The world outside was about to erupt in chaos, in panicked phone calls and furious emails. But in my workshop, there was only silence. The silence of a job done correctly. I had built my company, my contracts, my very life, with the same precision my father used to rebuild an engine. Every piece was designed to fit perfectly. Every contingency was planned for. They thought they were removing a single troublesome bolt. They had no idea it was the linchpin holding the entire engine together. The next morning began early. At 5:30, my phone rang. It was Dr. Eris Thorne. "Elias," he said, his voice tight with a strange mixture of panic and awe. "What did you do?" "I did what the contract stipulated," I replied calmly. "The contract? Elias, all hell is broken loose. The DOD is on the warpath. General Thorne himself is flying in. Vance is screaming about suing you into oblivion. The rest of the board, I've gotten 3 calls from members who are trying to understand why their own companies just got legal notices from you. They're terrified." "They should have read the agreement," I said. There was a pause. "They never saw you coming, did they?" "They weren't looking in the right direction," I said. "They were looking at me. They should have been looking at the work." At 7 o'clock, the financial news broke the story. A junior analyst at a major firm, tasked with monitoring SEC filings, flagged the Echelon Materials disclosure. The headline was cautious at first. "Supplier dispute threatens key Vance Aeronautics project." But the market is not cautious. It is a creature of pure, ravenous instinct. Vance Aeronautics stock, which had been trading at an all-time high, began to plummet in pre-market trading. At 8:15, the resignations started. They weren't resignations from Vance Aeronautics. They were resignations from the Odyssey Project Oversight Board. The first was from a man who ran a major avionics company. His firm relied on a specific Echelon-produced shielding composite for their guidance systems. He was not going to let his multi-billion-dollar company be jeopardized by Arthur Vance's personal feud. His resignation was a public act of distancing, of survival. 4 more followed within the hour. They were rats, leaving a ship they had only just realized was sinking. At 9 o'clock, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a civilian aide for General Thorne. The general, he informed me, would be landing at the Vance Aeronautics private airfield at 10:30. He was not requesting a meeting with Arthur Vance. He was requesting a meeting with me. I was to meet him at the main gate. I put on a simple, dark suit. I looked in the mirror. There was no triumph in my expression, no anger, just a quiet resolve. I thought of my father. Let the work speak. Today, the work would be giving a keynote address. The drive to Vance Aeronautics was different this time. Yesterday, I had driven away in quiet dismissal. Today, I was driving toward an inevitable conclusion. As I approached the main gate, I could see the chaos. News vans were parked down the road, held back by security. A black helicopter with military markings was descending toward the airfield. And standing just inside the gate were 2 figures. One was Dr. Eris Thorne, looking pale and sleepless. The other was a man I had never seen before, but I knew instantly who he was. General Marcus Thorne was tall, imposing, with a stillness about him that was more intimidating than any parade ground shout. He was not wearing a uniform, but he radiated command. I parked my car and got out. I walked toward them. Arthur Vance was nowhere to be seen. The general's aide, a young woman in a sharp suit, stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes?" "General Thorne." I nodded to her and then to the general. "General." He didn't offer to shake my hand. He just studied my face. "Mr. Hayes, we have a problem." "I am aware of the situation, General," I said. "This aircraft," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is not a corporate toy. It is a strategic national asset. Its failure is not an option. Your notice this morning has placed that asset in jeopardy." "With respect, General," I replied, my voice level. "The asset was placed in jeopardy yesterday, in that boardroom. My notice was merely a statement of fact." From behind us, a golf cart came speeding toward the gate. At the wheel was Arthur Vance. His face was blotchy and red, his perfectly styled hair in disarray. He slammed the cart to a halt and stormed toward us. "There you are," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You are finished. I will sue you, your pathetic little company. I will take everything." He then turned to the general. "General, my apologies. This is an internal corporate matter, a personnel issue. We will have it resolved." General Thorne did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He simply turned his head and looked at Vance, and the sheer cold weight of his gaze was enough to silence him. "Mr. Vance," the general said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion, "your access to this facility and to all materials related to the Odyssey project is hereby revoked, pending the results of a federal investigation into contract fraud and securities violations. Your company is in material breach of a national security contract. This is no longer your facility. As of this moment, it is a temporary federal asset." Vance's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. His certainty, the bedrock of his entire existence, had just been pulverized into dust. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. He hadn't seen me as a threat. He had seen me as a subordinate. He had never once considered that my power was not derived from his approval, but from the integrity of my work. He didn't see the creator of the material. He just saw that man. The general's aide spoke into a small radio. A moment later, 2 armed military police officers emerged from a black SUV that had been parked nearby. They walked calmly toward Vance. "Mr. Vance, you will be escorted off the premises," the general stated. It was not a request. As they led him away, a sputtering, defeated man, General Thorne turned back to me. "Dr. Thorne," he said, nodding to Eris, "was the only member of that board who seemed to understand the technical realities. He tells me you are the only man on Earth who can make this project work." "I designed the material the project is based on," I said simply. "So I now understand," the general said. He looked toward the massive assembly hangar where the first prototype of the Odyssey sat, a beautiful, useless skeleton of metal. "The Department of Defense is prepared to invoke the National Security Act to assume control of all patents and materials related to Ethelgard 7 to ensure the completion of this aircraft. We will of course provide just compensation. However, we would prefer a more collaborative arrangement." "I am listening," I said. "We need a new prime contractor, or a new director for the project, operating under federal authority, someone who can manage the technology, the production, and the integrity of the work from start to finish. Dr. Thorne has recommended you." I looked past him, at the hangar. I thought of the flawed fuselage spars. I thought of the pilots who would one day fly that machine at the edge of space. I thought of my father and the honest click of his wrench. The work wasn't finished. "I accept," I said. 6 months later, I stood in that same boardroom. The long mahogany table was gone. The 12 leather chairs were gone. It was my office now. The walls were bare, save for a large schematic of the Odyssey's airframe. The view from the expansive window looked out over the airfield, where the first fully completed Odyssey prototype, designated OD-01, was undergoing its final systems check. It was a magnificent sight, a machine of impossible grace and power. Arthur Vance was barred from all federal contracting for life. His company, mired in lawsuits from shareholders and a federal fraud investigation, was systematically dismantled. Its most valuable assets, including the production facilities, were absorbed by a new government-chartered entity created to manage the Odyssey program. I was its civilian director. I never saw Vance again. His fate was a matter of public record, a flat, unemotional entry in the annals of corporate failure. There was no pleasure in it. It was simply the consequence of his actions. The inevitable result of a man who valued his own pride more than the truth. Dr. Eris Thorne stood beside me at the window. He was now my head of research and development. He had shed the nervous energy he'd had in the boardroom and now carried the quiet confidence of a man whose belief in data had been vindicated. He looked at the aircraft, then at me. "She's perfect, Elias." "The work is sound," I agreed. On my desk, a large, clean expanse of dark wood, there was only one personal item. It was my father's torque wrench. It rested on a simple, custom-made stand, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder of where I came from and of the principles that guided me. My father had taught me that the world is full of noise and argument, of men who talk to hear themselves speak. But he also taught me that beneath all that noise, there are fundamental truths. The integrity of steel, the precision of a measurement, the honesty of a job done right. True power wasn't in shouting louder than everyone else. It was in building something so true, so undeniably correct, that it needed no defense. I picked up the wrench. Its weight was a familiar comfort, a connection to a quiet garage filled with the smell of oil and the promise of honest work. Its perfect, functional balance was a physical manifestation of an idea that had been tested and proven true. The work speaks for itself. It never lies. And when it finally speaks, you find out who was truly listening. I hope you are one of them.